I'm Virginia Rhodes, the project director for the ARC Network, and we're so excited to host Dr. Kimberly Scott from the third Virtual Visiting Scholars cohort for today's webinar. The Virtual Visiting Scholars program empowers scholars to complete metasyntheses and meta-analyses of existing literature to address critical issues relevant to equity in STEM. And before we introduce today's wonderful speaker, we need to take care of a few housekeeping items. So first, I'd like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will make those recordings available on our website and social media. Today, we'll also be using Zoom's integrated live captioning. And we understand the impact this may have on some of our participants, and we're working with our partners to provide live captioning that best supports the needs of our community. To walk you through some of the functions, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options, including live transcript. When clicking on the caret, it'll reveal options to show or hide subtitles, and you can also view or hide the full transcript as well. Also hovering over the bottom of your Zoom window will reveal the options for Q&A and chat located in the center. For the beginning of our webinar, you'll only be able to view the chat messages from the ARC team, and we'll share links to resources and our feedback survey in that. We'll also open the chat for attendees at the start of the Q&A portion. And if you have any questions for today's speaker, please add them to the Q&A, where you can also upvote questions that resonate with you. Now, WePan's Director of Research and Constituent Relations and ARC Network's PI, Heather Metcalf, will share more about the ARC Network.
Thanks, Virginia. So the goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners focused on gender equity. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions. Through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, our virtual visiting scholar program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folks experience. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advance program, and the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WePan, serves as our home organization. You can find ARC Network on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM and hashtag Equity in STEM. We're also excited to launch our new website where you can visit the ARC Network and learn more about our team, our events, and our programs. And the website is equityinstem.org. We also have a few announcements that we're excited to share with the community. We just recently launched our proposal submission portal on the Equity in STEM website for the 2022 Equity in STEM community convening jointly hosted by the ARC Network and WePan. The link is in the chat if you want to check out the call for proposals. Stay tuned for more information about registration, which will be opening soon, as well as our COVID protocols and information for organizations interested in sponsoring the event. We'd also like to share that the NSF Advance funded Bowling Green State University Allies program is hosting a conference on allyship and inclusive leadership strategies for advancing gender equity for faculty. The date and registration information can be found in the chat, as well as a link. Lastly, if you're an institution of higher education and you want to showcase your efforts to address inequity during the COVID-19 pandemic, consider submitting to the NSF's Taking Action COVID-19 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Challenge. Information can be found in the link in the chat, and the deadline to submit is on January 30th. Now for why we're really here. I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Stephanie Page, ARC Network's Community Engagement Manager, who will introduce us to today's speaker.
Thank you so much. And as you can tell, we are very excited to host what is our final project presentation for cohort 3 of the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program. And we just want to say that we are so thankful to everyone who has taken the time to join us throughout this series and to all of our virtual visiting scholars. Today's guest is Dr. Kimberly Scott. Dr. Scott is a professor of women and gender studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. And Dr. Scott is the founding executive director of ASU's Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology. The center is a one-of-a-kind research unit, excuse me, focused on exploring, identifying, and creating innovative scholarships about underrepresented women and girls in STEM. Having written and successfully won over $12 million in grant funding to support research about and programs for women and girls of color in STEM, Dr. Scott was named in 2014 a White House Champion of Change for STEM access. Since 2018, Dr. Scott has been a member of the NSF STEM Education Advisory Panel, created to encourage US scientific and technological innovations in education, and assembled in consultation with the US Department of Education, NASA, and NOAA. Center projects include the National Science Foundation funded CompuGirls, US Department of Education funded CompuPower, the Gates Foundation funded project on African American families and technology use, and NSF funded culturally responsive co-robotics program. Dr. Scott is also an affiliate faculty at George Mason University Center for Digital Media, Innovation, and Diversity in Fairfax, Virginia. She has recently appointed to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on Addressing the Underrepresentation of Women of Color in Tech. Dr. Scott earned her BA from Smith College in Art History and French Literature, also her master's from Long Island University in Curriculum and Instruction in Elementary Education, and her EDD from Rutgers University in Social and Philosophical Foundations of Education, and completed the High Potentials Leadership Program at Harvard Business School. Welcome, Dr. Scott, and let's get switched over for your slides.
Thank you so much, Dr. Page, and good afternoon, good evening, good day to everyone who's joining me here. And hopefully this will be a lively discussion, and we will have time to really go through some of the things that I'm proposing. But I also want to begin with a huge thanks to a fantastic research team that helped me get to this point in terms of gathering data, analyzing data, and being able to present it to you. So big shout out to Dr. Michael Simeone, who is the data scientist who continues to work with me, Pranati, Porus, Christine, and Luis. So thank you to them. Next slide, please. I'd like to put into context some of the topics that have become really, really important to me and that have driven me to do this particular project. So we recall that in 1976, AAAS report was published based on a 1975 meeting. And it was in this report called the Double Bind that it was very, very clearly stated that both private and public funding agencies must invest in programs for women of color in STEM. The report also said that private and public funding agencies must examine the impact of their investments in participating or on participation of women of color in STEM. Years later, 2010, thanks to an NSF-funded mini symposium that was also focused on women of color in STEM, there was a report led by Mia Ang, and that too clearly said that we need to pay attention to women of color in STEM, but it also made some really specific recommendations, including that additional funds need to be made to support initiatives for girls, women of color, and STEM, and that the effects of broader impacts need to be tethered to continuing funding, to getting more funding from NSF. 2015, the White House under the Obama administration hosted a summit thanks to the White House Council on Women and Girls. And it was during this summit, there was specific attention paid to the downward trajectory of girls of color taking AP computer science and their low representation in STEM careers. 2016, Computer Science for All created a coalition with NSF, US Department of Education and other federal agencies, as well as private partners, to create a collective impact model. And one of the foci was on girls of color. 2 years later, 2018, private industries like Microsoft and so many others, but also federal agencies such as National Science Foundation, United States Department of Ed, and the Health and Humanities, they provided between $2.8 to $3.4 billion specifically on broadening participation programs. And then in 2021, in October, the National Academies released a committee consensus report specifically about transforming trajectories for women of color in tech. So there's been a lot of movement since 1976 to 2021. But as we go to the next slide, unfortunately, statistics illustrate that not much has changed. This particular table, I am grateful to have gotten access to and created to examine how women of color are doing as it relates to specific STEM areas. And what this table calculates is the percentage of racial, ethnic, gender compared with the bachelor's degrees conferred by discipline to US citizens. So what this means is if we see the first column, that out of all individuals who earned their bachelor's degree, and this is according to the 2019 information, all individuals, there are 34.5% who were white, but if we break it down for discipline, so bioscience, white women earn 34.4% of the total percentage of degrees in bioscience. And you see it goes on for computer science, math, engineering, and physical science. What we see here is disparity. What we see here, particularly for Black and African-American women, that the 6.3% is incongruent with the individual disciplinary representations. Next slide, please. And because I am interested in terms of the influence of time on these data, I've looked and we've created this chart using NCES and IPEDS data to place the graduation completion rates over time for first-time, full-time students at a public institution. What we see here is from 2008 to 2015, Black African-American female students had the lowest percent completion rate, with the cohort of 2008 graduating almost 12% of students, and the cohort of 2015 graduating nearly 17%. And this is based on STEM writ large. This trend shows that while growth has occurred in the percent completion rates of Black and African-American female students, it is far behind the completion rates of other groups. What I say is by far the most erratic trend lines is that of Pacific Islander students, with their 2008 cohort graduating just over 15% of students, only to fall to 11.4% the next year in 2009. And then it goes back up in 2010 to 16.8%. Once again, sure, there is a positive growth in the completion rate for these students, but it's still trailing behind other student groups, including white and Hispanic women. Next slide, please. So why? We've seen in the literature that some explanations for these gaps, while they are persistent, has to do with motivation. I've done a strike through line because I think all of us can agree that motivation is not the issue. Women of color, in some cases, are more motivated, more interested in pursuing a STEM degree. Some people say it's grit. They say, well, you know, certain populations just don't have as much grit as others, in this case, women of color. Not true. Again, if we look at the data, a lot of grit, a lot of interest. And certainly the argument of, well, just certain populations just don't have the intellect, or they don't have the intellectual capital. And that's why we see these numbers. No, again, another strike through. What we can agree on is that most individuals will say that there are structural constraints, such as hostile environments, that are preventing a reversal in any sustained way to these statistics. However, next slide, please. For the purposes of my VBS project, I took seriously what Dwana Franklin, who's the CEO of Reboot Representation, said in her 2018 report. And it reads here, underrepresented women and girls of color fall through the cracks. Though companies express a strong desire to reach underrepresented women of color, less than 0.1% or 335,000 of the 32 tech companies' 2017 philanthropic giving focused on reaching them specifically. So for my project, the goal was to apply an intersectional lens, and I'll talk about what I mean by intersectionality in a few slides, but to apply an intersectional lens as an analytical strategy to discover how funding agencies reinforce or challenge majoritarian narratives of girls, women of color in STEM. And there were three objectives that shaped my steps. One, I wanted to illustrate how well-known and well-intentioned funding practices address race, ethnic, gender disparity in STEM through funding. I also wanted to illuminate how and when funding agencies emphasize the disparity. And lastly, identify methods funders can successfully invest in what I call the race, gender, technology movement. Next slide, please. So, what do I mean by intersectionality? I've been incredibly influenced, as I know many of you have, by Patricia Hill Collins' most recent book, Intersectionality as Critical Social Theory. If you have not had an opportunity to read this 2019 volume, I encourage you to do so. In the volume, she lays out some really specific constructs of intersectionality: social context, relationality, power, social inequality, complexity, and social justice. These are the elements that she argues make up the architecture of intersectionality, whether it's used as a metaphor, or it's used as a resistant project, or it's used as a methodological heuristic tool. Here are the building blocks that we should continuously be referring back to when we are claiming to use intersectionality as a lens to understand oppression, domination, but also to do something about these structures. Next slide, please. So keeping that in mind, I looked very carefully at lots and lots and lots of data along with my research team. In particular, we identified 2,400 NSF solicitations. We actually identified 5,300 solicitations, or files, if you will, and created our own web crawler. However, we could only get access to 2,400 files because those were the only files that were retrievable, meaning that we found a link to a specific PDF with the actual solicitation. For NIH, we looked at 15,000 solicitations or funding opportunity announcements. We also wanted to look beyond the federal agencies at the private and corporate foundations. That proved to be very challenging. But let me start with saying we used Boren's database in order to identify 338 separate files to detect what is going on or what is being funded from these agencies. As for ARCO, we looked at 89 files, and we also looked at 830 files from Foundation directory. And then literally 4 weeks before the end of this particular project, the official end, because I continue to do work, the Lilly Foundation from Indiana released the Women and Girls Index. Well, thank goodness for that. They had captured from 2012 to 2018 over 47,000 organizations that had received charitable giving. We filtered those 47,000 plus organizations to identify those organizations that had received funding thanks to them describing some project having to do with women, girls of color, women of color, and STEM. That winnowed it down to 674, which was fantastic because that actually allowed us to see the types of grant-making organizations, more so than Morgan, ARCO, or Foundation directory. Next slide, please. Critical quantitative methods. So this is where, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Michael Simeoni was instrumental. We used computational topic modeling, which required me to experience an incredibly steep learning curve, but it was well worth it to understand, to explore, to make sense of how these incredibly large data sets were providing patterns along funding, whether it was looking at who was funding or who was getting the funding. Next slide, please. Oftentimes I'm asked what were the analytical tools that we used. And so I wanted to make sure that we have this table here. We used a lot of analytical tools. So probabilistic topic modeling was used to put pressure on human generated categories to see how topics tell the story about girls, women of color in STEM. Careful observations of the federal agencies of NSF and NIH were examined, looking at their solicitations that allowed us to conduct colloquy and concordance analyses, which I won't go into in great detail. However, I will say a technical report was created. We also used Python and libraries such as GenSim and Scikit to achieve topic modeling. In short, topic modeling enabled us to know about the types of documents we identified. And these data were ultimately downloaded into Tableau, for instance, so that we could visualize and analyze comparatively across documents. Additionally, average award amounts per foundation were calculated, as well as other summary statistics for awards by foundation type. When we examine the full text of any grant or RFP, we use linguistic applications such as ANTCOP, and we also were able to do concordance plots, frequency word pairs, and general word associations with other kinds of words. I'll just say for colloquy, and again, I continue to learn, a colloquy provided meaningful results, documenting changes as to what terms appear where over time. So more than providing the relative or raw frequency or occurrences, the colloquy analyses, we used a confidence interval, meaning a p-value, to demonstrate statistical significance of words appearing together within a collocational window of 5 words to the left and 5 words to the right. Then the concordances allowed us to identify where in the text a word can be found. And I'll show an example in a few slides. Next slide, please. So I want to get to the findings because I am conscious of time. We created, oh my gosh, easily 50 charts, and we can create 50 more charts if we wanted to. But in the interest of time and wanting to really have opportunity for us to dialogue, I want to stick with some of the more surprising findings. So when we looked at NSF, our initial analysis provided few words with high frequency. For instance, the word Latino and African American did not appear enough to soundly analyze either. And since keywords were not accounting for enough of a proportion, I really was interested in exploring how keywords, again, tethered to intersectionality, appear over time. So then my research question, my objective somewhat morphed. And I said, well, let's see how the social constructs of intersectionality appear when and how. So specifically, how do we see words such as participation, or perhaps not social justice, but action? Or if we're thinking about social categories, how do we see Latino, Latina? How do we see African American? What are their word neighbors? Where do we see women? What did we find? A couple of things that I found super interesting. 2001, the word participation became a really big colloquy for women. The first time the word participation appears, according to our analysis, is 1998. At the same time, you will see that the term Negro was detected in 1998. This is again in NSF solicitations, and it maintained the same frequency and occurrence until 2012. Beyond 2012, we did not detect its presence. Now, I know some of you are sitting there saying, why? Why the word Negro? Or did I make a mistake and did I mean 1888? Well, no. But what we did do, it was drill down a little further in the data. And for reasons beyond my knowledge, the word Negro it appeared in 98 to 2012 because there was emphasis on partnerships with United Negro College Fund, the NAACP. Other things that I found interesting, topic analysis indicates that there was not a swell of the term women being mentioned consistently. Instead, when we did the colloquy perusal, women as a term becomes mentioned as part of a triptych. So women we would see close to minority and maybe underrepresented as a word. The frequency analysis illustrates the word women was included consistently, but when I wanted to see for intersectionality, the word intersectionality by itself only appeared less than a dozen times out of the more than 2,000 solicitations. Broadening participation, increasing participation, advancement are all related to underrepresented communities. So there's no mention that I could find in terms of words such as leadership or vision. Instead, there seems to be more of an emphasis on participation into a system, which I argue is an assimilationist approach. Next slide, please. NIH. Now, as you may remember, NIH, we had more to work with. And that's because we were able to access more files in NIH. And then to the right, perhaps of your screen, that's an example of concordance plot. So it's not an example of exact data, but more of an example of a way that we use to analyze data. And a concordance plot reveals the distribution of terms in a given document. So we can see where certain terms are clustered in a particular document as opposed to at other points of that particular document. So with NIH, we found between the years 92 to 2020 that there were only 98 sentences that had the term women of color. Now that's more than we saw in NSF. We could only find it 7 times, but as I said, we only had access to a fifth of NSF's documents. Latino and Native American appeared in NSF, meaning those terms, but did not in NIH. I believe that this does not mean Native American doesn't appear at all in NIH, but the words are not appearing collocated with the word women. We don't see Native American and women being in any close proximity. But I thought also was very interesting about NIH data is that we see that there's a trend for using the word inclusion in their funding opportunity announcements. We do see where the word inclusion is coming up. Next slide, please. When looking at the character count in NIH of the word underrepresented, the word underrepresented doubled between 1992 and 1993. While there were not a lot of files using underrepresented in 92, there was an explosion. And then if you look carefully, and I know it's challenging to see because the yellow is the underrepresented line, we also see an uptick in 1996 of the term underrepresented and in 2003. Again, this is NIH. In fact, in 1996, there were we counted more than 2 million times in the files that the term underrepresented appeared in NIH FOAs. In 2003, however, some change occurred, which resulted in the term underrepresented appearing more frequently. So we don't see a lot of up and down with the arrows. And this increase in usage could mean there's more funding opportunities for projects about, with, or for underrepresented groups, or it could simply be reflecting the usage of the term underrepresented. Well, when I saw this, I said, well, where is underrepresented appearing in terms of participation? I had several questions. I said, perhaps NIH sought proposals interested in poising underrepresented groups to participate in a meaningful way. And that's the blue line. I personally hypothesized that we would see the blue and the yellow lines closer together, but as you can tell, that was not the result at all. We don't see, except for in 1997, that's the closest, but then you see a larger and larger gap where the concept of underrepresentation was not necessarily correlated or in any way shown closely to the word or concept of participation. Next slide, please. Corporate foundations. As we look at this slide, let me just explain that this illustrates grantees of corporate foundations ranked by total awards within the study time window, with the awards highlighted by mention of the following terms. So we search for terms such as STEM, that's the left, women, that's the middle one, and then women of color. The orange bars indicate the mention of terms, and the blue reveals that there's no mention of terms, but they still got money. So this figure demonstrates the organizations that receive the most grant funds from corporations. What we see is that nearly 55 awards were given to SWE, Society of Women Engineers. Again, the vast majority of awards are not provided to grantees who mention the term women of color. Instead, the term women seems to carry more attention than even the term STEM. Now, as we move on to the next slide. Over time, however, corporate foundations have indicated, according to this analysis, greater interest in funding projects with the terms women and girls. So if the term or word women and girls appears in a project description issued by presumably the grantee, we've seen that they were funded at a higher rate than other terms. There was, however, interest in funding Black women. If you look very carefully at the bottom row, we see that funding peaked in 2007, 2013, and 2017 by corporations giving funding if there was in the project description the terms Black women. Next slide, please. Over time, corporate foundations have indicated greater interest, yes, in women of color. However, we did not find any evidence of other specific race gender groups mentioned in project descriptions, such as Latina or Latinx women, Native American women, or Asian American women, or their subgroups such as Hmong or Laotian. And the mention of computer science does not follow the same pattern as those using women and girls. However, in 2005, both terms accrued similar interest, suggesting that corporate foundations were equally interested in funding computer science with and for women of girls that same year. Data suggests that 2017 was the year in which the terms Black girls, women, and computer science were most popular. And this is actually, I'm sorry, can you go back a slide? Yes, 2013, if you had the terms Black girls, women, and computer science, that was most popular in terms of gaining corporate funding. And this trend repeated in 2017. However, funding for project descriptions, including the terms, waned after 2017. So I'm putting together the row that has Black women, the row that has just the term women, and then the row that has computer science. Now, next slide. Sorry about that. Yeah, you can go back one slide. Private foundations. Yes, thank you. Private foundations. This particular one, similarly, its grantees are private foundations, so individuals who got the money ranked by total awards within the study time period. So again, orange is yes, they mention these terms, women or STEM or women of color, or blue is no. And so what we see is code.org brings in 13 million from private or community foundations for work using the term women. Except for Girls Inc., foundations are not, according to this analysis, funding programs mentioning women of color in any significant way. Mentioning STEM does not seem to capture the attention of most grantees receiving private foundation. So grantees are not using the term STEM per se and getting sizable amounts of money. And it's not clearly depicted in this grant or in this particular graphic, but as I said, we have many, many graphics. We did find that Girls Who Code is a top grantee related to computer science awards coming from private foundations. But in their project descriptions, we did not find sufficient evidence that they're talking about computer science and girls of color. Next slide, please. Now, this is where I was talking about foundation types, thanks to Women and Girl Index. What we can see, and I know it's challenging to see, is which type of foundations, mainly all private foundations or some corporate foundations, are funding who. So here we see Girls Who Code, and sometimes it's reflected as Girls Who Code Inc. We see that they have gotten a considerable amount of money with project descriptions using the key term technology from foundations such as the Prudential Foundation, Start Small, LLC. We also see that TechBridge has received sizable amounts of money from the National Science Foundation, and Black Girls Code has also received sizable amounts from Silicon Valley Community Foundation. To put this into better context, next slide, please. Black Girls Code, I wanted to drill down on Black Girls Code. It stands out with the most funding from a corporate foundation and the least from family foundations. And if you remember a couple of slides ago, they're using the term in their project descriptions, Black girls, sometimes women of color, and computer science. I found this very interesting. Next slide, please. I know this is a lot of information, and so I wanted to summarize the findings as best as I can and return to the objectives of this project. So objective 1 was to illustrate how funding practices were addressing race, ethnic, gender disparity. My words, in some, gender at best, or technology at best, or one unit of analysis at best is illustrated. But when we think about using intersectional lens to understand race, ethnicity, gender, and other disciplines in STEM, funding practices represented by who's getting funding or what solicitations are going out to curry funding are struggling with using intersectional identities. And certainly when it comes to ideas of power and leadership, social justice and agency, and other constructs of intersectionality, we were unable to find any significant evidence of funding, whether it be private or federal, interested in those types of programs or research. Second objective, if you may remember, I wanted to illuminate how and when funding agencies emphasize the disparity. At best, what we find is they'll represent disparity according to underrepresentation, but not necessarily disparity as it relates to promotion, or if it relates to collaboration, or relates to other ways that power plays out at micro, meso, or macro level. And then third, I wanted to identify methods funders can successfully invest. And what I did find, because I didn't want this to be a complete tale of woe, is that there are some good models out there in terms of funding agencies that are trying to engage in participatory investments, trying to really apply through culturally responsive assessment ways how to be inwardly facing and understand their practices and make them more equitable. But what we do see is that this is not widespread and that there's a lack of communication amongst funders as to who's doing what with whom. Next slide, please. So in closing, I want to go back to Patricia Hill Collins, and I remind myself and others that when we're doing these types of analysis, it's not just about generating new ideas. But what I'm hoping is that we can learn from this, continuing to grow, but also think about how a field, in this case, philanthropy researchers, but I would also argue funders and higher education, can reorganize our practices to facilitate problem-solving objectives. More specifically, for funders, I think that there needs to be more intersectionality assessments. I think that time needs to be put forward and money needs to be put forward to literally creating intersectionality assessments, which need to recognize solutions privilege. That it's not going to be easy to come up with solutions to disparity as it disproportionately affects women of color in STEM, and particularly in technology. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be complex because we live in a complex system. Again, returning to intersectionality. And that I do believe that funders need to create and implement an accountability system. Again, I want to draw attention to the Henry Luce Foundation. It has a really interesting model in terms of accountability, and I think more needs to be learned from what they are doing. Along those lines, funders need to engage in more transparent practices. I can talk during the question and answer period. Getting these data was incredibly challenging. It took a team of us, and we still don't have the complete data set because it's decentralized. But yet there is a cry for social justice and for us to fund things differently. In order to do that, I'm distinctly concerned, and I'm also putting out a clarion call that we need to be transparent in our systems, and we need to include culturally responsive collaborations. For researchers, we need more researchers to engage in critical quantitative methodology and to do so through interdisciplinary approaches. Again, I'm a social scientist. On the research team, I was the content expert. And I had the good fortune, thanks to the VVS, to work with a data scientist and graduate students from across the campus. More of this type of of exercises and projects need to be done. And then finally, for higher education, there needs to be a transformation of policy, particularly for promotion and tenure. And the transformation needs to include what kind of research are we going to value? And should we reconsider the barometers of success? Is research, or rather is success simply about how much money you get from external grant making, or is it a question of what you do with that money, with whom, and to what extent? I would hope that that last question can be answered in sustainable ways by creating a different type of system when it comes to funding, particularly when we're thinking about women of color and STEM. Thank you. Next slide. Questions, comments, concerns. And this is my most recent book, my fourth book, which talks about one of the programs that has been supported by some of the agencies that I put up there on the slide. It talks mainly about the girls and their peer cultures, and it illustrates the point that I said earlier, that it's not a question of motivation, it's not a question of grit, but it has something to do with our systems and the hierarchical representations of oppression.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for that amazing presentation and for all of the hard work that went into pulling together the research that you did as a virtual visiting scholar. We welcome folks to put some questions into the Q&A, and we already have one. One that says, thanks so much for this amazing presentation and the contribution you're making to advancing women of color in STEM. Chanda says, as a tenure track woman of color in STEM who is turning in her third year review documents tomorrow, I'm eager to be able to cite this work. Where will it be available, and what planned follow-ups are you able to tell us about? Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to say congratulations for getting to that benchmark of putting in your third year review. That's fantastic. And I hope that you take yourself out afterwards and relax for the remainder of the weekend. After you get your packets in. In terms of where this data are available, and Heather, you can talk more. I know that the report, which I continue to tweak and refine, will be made available.
Yes, we'll be making the report available both on the website and in the ARC Network resource library. So you can look forward to receiving it there. We'll also be sending it out with the recap of this webinar. So there'll be the report and links to the video recording and transcript made available there very shortly.
Great. And then in answer to the other question about, what am I doing now with this data? I have gone down the data rabbit hole. I continue, thanks to Michael, to play with these data. And there's always new data. Some of the foundations that I have named have reached out to me and asked to run their data and given us access to their databases. So that's really exciting. I am now a senior faculty fellow at the Arizona State University Foundation, and I get the fantastic privilege of working on the philanthropic and development advancement side of things. And I'm using these data to help to direct what I'm doing and also guide the strategies that I am learning about and hoping to influence. So that's some of the stuff that I will be continuing to do. Not to mention, I do have another book coming out from Oxford University Press at this point, maybe 2024, and it will include some of these data.
So just a couple of things in the works here.
Just a few.
Just a thing here and there. Great. We also have a question from Vernon. Was there any analysis of NOAA or NASA funding?
Thanks, Vernon. No. That's the quick answer. No, we did enough. We couldn't do everything. I will say that I think that NASA in particular would be really, really interesting. And I think it would be very, very interesting to do NASA. particularly if we look at the astrophysics data, and Vernon, you know this more than anybody, and underrepresentation. I will say this, while we didn't look at NASA or NOAA, we did look at somewhat of a side project. I did look at who is leading which type of foundations. And not too surprisingly, the foundations that have the largest assets have a greater probability of being led by white men. So the smaller foundations, by way of assets, tend to be led by people who have been underrepresented in some form or fashion, which I think is very interesting. Same for boards. I found the more the assets, the more white male the boards.
Yeah, that trend is not coincidental.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And one thing that I found disturbing, I didn't go into it in the presentation, is that we are seeing a trend where, while there are foundations that certainly do want to fund things related to racial and gender justice, there still tends to be greater funding for organizations that are led by white males who are still saying they want to do the work, but in communities that they have no history or no stories, no connections. So what does this mean in terms of who we're funding? But I think, how are we perceiving the capacity and commitment and ability of those individuals to do the work?
thanks, Kim. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A about models that have been successful, and asking you to expand on your remarks about that, including a request to further describe the Henry Luce Foundation model for accountability.
Sure.
And sharing thoughts on transferability to federal agencies offering funding.
Good point. I failed to mention one of the other things that I did with our data collection were informal interviews. I don't include specific quotes because I did not do IRB, but the informal unprecedented interviews were a result of me talking about this project, talking about the virtual visiting scholar, and people saying, oh my gosh, tell me more. And then the floodgates would open and I would learn an incredible amount that helped me triangulate the data and serve as complementary to the analyses. And so I learned in the course of conversation about some of these fantastic models. Specifically, Henry Luce Foundation, they are, I think, to be commended because they will keep track of funding. So you know how many of us, we have to do an annual report, and it's not perhaps sure if your program officer actually reads your annual report or not. But Henry Luce does read the annual report, and they do take particular attention to the money that's being spent in a given year. And they have been known to pull money from organizations if they have claimed that they were going to do one thing and they end up not doing it. There also seems to be more emphasis on participatory grant making. And what that I've learned means is when an organization will engage those individuals, participants that are going to be most affected by a funded project. Example, New School Venture Fund, they, surprisingly to some, engage families and kids, because they put an RFP out specifically for family and kids. And it was the family and kids who were doing the reviews of those proposals that were aiming to work with them. That's participatory grant making. And so there are some models like that.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question here. Let's see. We have a question about hope. What hope do you have for changing the metrics of success, as you mentioned toward the end of the presentation, not just with money, but with whom you are working and how you are enabling broader participation and change?
Great question. And yes, I'm trying to be optimistic, but at the same time, balance that with realism. And, you know, I do have hope, especially if we look at OSTP, the Office of Science Technology Policy, and we look at that we have for the first time ever a deputy director who's a social scientist, right? Dr. Alondra Nelson, who is working with the director of OSTP, and she is invested in terms of, I mean, the whole OSTP under this particular administration is invested in terms of different barometers of success. And so I think that we are starting to see, at least I'm starting to see, a couple of examples of decision makers at various levels. I just gave an example at the federal level, but there are others that are seriously looking at their policies, seriously looking at the system in terms of how can we put pressure points on the system so that it can lead to greater equity. I think what's important, at least for me to always continue, is that this is about a system. This is not only about how can we train, and I don't like to say train because I train my animals, I don't train people, but how can we, you know, we train women of color to enter a flawed system? You know, so then how can we give more money to programs that are going to shore them up to be what I call astronauts, meaning they don a particular suit in order to survive in inhospitable places. And so thankfully, we're starting to see, again, more discussion and more consideration for that's not working clearly if we look at the statistics. Let's try something else, and let's try something else that's empirically sound. Let's try something else that is tethered to a more complex understanding of intersectionality, and let's actually measure what we're doing. There are actually, and it speaks more to my current work, there are actually enclaves, mainly regional, philanthropic organizations getting together and creating consortia to specifically focus on what do we mean by funding socially just initiatives. This gives me hope.
Wow, what a great note to wrap up on. Such great insight that you're offering us. We do have a number of other questions left in the Q&A. People clearly want to have more conversation with you. We will share these questions with you, and if you have a moment to offer a few insights on them, we can share them back out with the recording and the recap of the webinar. But for now, I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Stephanie Page to close us out for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. I am floored. I am at a loss for words. Thankfully, I wrote our closing down because I don't know that I would be able to really articulate what it has meant to hear from you about this work and just the authentic context that are so meaningful to so many of us here. And to remind our attendees, Dr. Scott's report will be shared along with the recording, and it will be made available on our various outlets and in the resource library. You can also find more about Dr. Scott's work and other resources that she has curated in the library. We're just so incredibly thankful again for our attendees for this webinar and for all of our webinars in the Virtual Visiting Scholar Series featuring Cohort 3. We ask that you provide feedback on your experience with today's webinar by completing the survey that we are dropping in the chat. And just one more thank you for joining us for this really incredible series. Thank you to our virtual visiting scholars. Thank you, Dr. Scott. And we look forward to bringing you more webinars this year and to seeing you at the community convening. Thank you.